Hello, and welcome to the Fostering Success Michigan webinar series. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today, we have a special presentation from Brittany Bartkowiak on the power of sharing your story. The webinar today will be talking about personal experiences, such as the experience in foster care, and how challenging that can be to navigate. Even when it's hard to talk about, sharing your story can have an incredible impact on other people and can be empowering for the other people who you are sharing that story with. The power of sharing your story will provide education, empowerment, and resources for students to feel prepared to share their story and their experience in a public way. This webinar will cover how to establish boundaries, tackle intrusive questions, and tips for both students and professionals who want to incorporate personal experiences in their work. The power of sharing your story will also contain comprehensive media training and preparation for young people to feel confident when interacting with the media on sensitive issues. We would like to say thank you to our webinar sponsors today, the Havermill Foundation, the Kresge Foundation, and Western Michigan University. And we would like to introduce Brittany Bartkowiak.
Thank you, Maddie. It's great to be here.
All right. And I should have introduced myself. I apologize. My name is Maddie Day. I'm the Director of Outreach and Training. I will be facilitating this, but Brittany will be presenting the webinar for the majority of our time today. Just a couple housekeeping things. If you have questions, you can use the questions feature on your right sidebar. You can enter in questions at any part in time during this webinar. And Brittany will go through and answer these questions as she is able. We will have some time for questions at the end, but we're hoping that this will be an interactive opportunity for you guys to interact with Brittany and ask questions as she's going. There are also handouts. These handouts are available also on the sidebar just under the questions feature. You can open those handouts at any part or at any time throughout this presentation. These handouts and this recording will be available on the fosteringsuccessmichigan.com website. On Thursday, the full recording will be up. The webinar and the handouts will be available also at that time. All right, so while I introduce Brittany, she's going to get herself situated, and then we're going to start with the webinar, and she will have control. Brittany Bartkowiak has received her Master's of Social Work from the University of Michigan with a focus on management of children, youth, and family services. Brittany currently works for Michigan Radio's State of Opportunity Project as an outreach producer. Brittany is dedicated to empowering others to share their experiences in a meaningful, safe way. As a former Fostering Success Michigan student ambassador, Brittany has shared her experience sharing portions of her story in a public setting, both as in presentations and through Brittany's blog, the blog featured on the Fostering Success Michigan website. Brittany is passionate about sharing her story and helping prepare others to do the same. I welcome Brittany, and you now have control.
Great. Thank you so much, Maddie. It is such a pleasure to be with you all today, and I'm really excited to spend some time with you and talk about tactics for sharing your story. I'd love to know who's listening and who's in the room. So if you want to take advantage of the chat function that Maddie talked about and just type if you're a student listening, a professional, and then what part of the state or country that you're from. I'd love to know, who I'm speaking with. And I would really love for this to be an interactive conversation. So if at any point you have any questions or comments to add to the conversation in the presentation, please write them in the chat function to the right side of the screen, and I will do my best to try to get to them and add them to the presentation. Now let's see here. Just to go over a brief agenda for the next hour. We'll be going over, how to talk about some kind of not so pleasant experiences sometimes, and also some tactics for sharing them in a safe and meaningful way. And we'll also be doing a little bit of media training toward the end to try to give students the skills that you need when interacting with the media, because sometimes when you do share your story in a more public way or on the internet, folks can contact you when they wish, and it's good to have some skills in your back pocket for if that were to happen. And I wanted to share with you all that my intention today is not to persuade you or dissuade you from sharing your story. I feel really strongly that you should only share your story and talk about your experience in foster care or other adverse experiences that we all may encounter when you feel ready. So this webinar will focus on some things that I've learned in the past and some things that I wish I would have known when I started out writing and talking about my experiences. But please, if there's something that you've practiced that you feel strongly about and that works for you, I believe that you're the expert in your own situation. And I'm seeing some, friendly names and check in the chat here, so it's really great. Welcome all of you, and thank you so much for joining us. So to briefly share a little bit about my story and my experiences, I've shared them in a variety of ways, both speaking at national and statewide presentations, writing blogs on Fostering Success Michigan's website, as you can see on the screen, also in newsletters such as the MYOI newsletter, and also with State of Opportunity, where I now work. And I've also had experience talking about my story, on the bus when I'm talking with friends and family, in college, in classes. And I find that I do it a little bit differently each time. And I've really kind of developed a system for myself to identify when I feel safe sharing my story and some precautions that I take when doing that. So I'm excited to share that with you today. So now we're going to talk about, why share your story in the first place? Why would anybody want to talk about their past? And so first up, your story is completely unique. And stories are part of our culture. The world that we live in is built on stories. Talking about history is sharing stories. And two people perceive the same exact situation differently. Your story is unique because as somebody who identifies as female, I may have experienced something completely differently, such as foster care, than somebody my exact same age who might be male. So even if you feel like your story has already been told before, it really hasn't, not with your collection of intersecting identities. And then in a lot of situations, people learn about experiences like foster care based on statistics. And stories really help bring some context and illustration to the statistics that we have out there about foster care and other child welfare related issues. And similarly, along with that same line, statistics is a form of data. And if somebody's just looking at you based on data, like such as a GPA, for example, when you're applying to college, telling a story, like including your personal narrative in your essay statement and your college application, that can really help provide some context to this data, these statistics that they're seeing about your grades. Maybe you switch schools, and so that's why there's a lap in your GPA or credits, for example, and just looking at the data, you may not know that. So stories can really help provide some context to statistics and data. And your story matters. Stories really bring policy into practice and show how policy is enacted on the ground, which is really, really important. So stories can in turn educate, influence, and promote change, especially when lawmakers can really understand how your story it really implements that policy that they're dealing with. And I know Michigan's Children does a great job of doing like Kids Speak events where people are allowed to share their story and testimony, and then how those policies are put into place. And finally, stories don't tell, they show. And so sometimes you can just hear that somebody was in foster care, you can hear like this very blanket statement about someone's experiences, but stories can really help illustrate what that experience was like for you. And next here, stories are a form of connection. So there are actually biological benefits to storytelling. Telling stories and hearing stories, they actually have a positive impact on your body and your brain. It actually releases hormones like cortisol and oxytocin, and those hormones promote bonding with other people, and they help release stress. So there are actual biological benefits to storytelling. And then another reason, that we often fail to share our stories is that, we're afraid, and shame really plays into that. So especially with some of the stigma surrounding foster care, shame may keep young people from talking about their experiences. However, empathy is actually the antidote to shame. And so that means that when you talk about something and you understand that somebody else also went through something similar and that somebody else got through it, that's one way to have empathy and to connect with someone else over that experience. So it will actually become easier to share your story when other people do the same and when you can connect with them over that. And it can feel really good and powerful to share your story. But be a little careful with this. I'm not saying that sharing your story is always healing or always feel good, but it definitely can, and it can be really positive to see where you are now compared to where you've been, and actually verbalizing that to another person or writing it down kind of helps put that into perspective for you and can kind of be this objective way of looking at things. So now we're going to launch into different ways to share your story. And this is one I would especially love to hear from the audience here if there are other things that I fail to mention. But here are some things that I thought about, some different ways that you can share your story. And talking about your story doesn't always need to be through writing or speaking. You can tell a story through art, through a play, through participating in research, by writing a poem, writing a book. We see so many memoirs out there, especially around foster care. In a blog or journal, with the media, with a friend. So if there are other ways that you've shared your story, especially if it involves the experience of foster care, I would love for you to chime in the chat section and share with us some more ways that you can do that. And I wanted to show you a visual of different stories about foster care that have been shared here. So you'll see, State of Opportunity on the screen. We often at State of Opportunity, we share stories about people who have come from low-income backgrounds or otherwise adverse experiences. Foster Club, they feature blogs on their website, just like Fostering Success Michigan does in the middle there. And then there's been a few novels that I've read, including To the End of June, which is a memoir about foster care in America. And I also wanted to highlight the Removed series on YouTube. I don't know if anybody in the audience has had a chance to view it, but it's kind of a theatrical representation about the experience of foster care. So they have a script and actors and actresses, and it's one way to tell a story, without actually just verbalizing it or writing about it. But I do want to focus a lot of our presentation today on the experience of sharing your story through writing, because that's what the future FSM bloggers will be doing, and that was what I was able to do during my time with Fostering Success Michigan. Really found it to be such an empowering way to talk about your experiences, and it really helped me, craft my story when I was sharing it through writing, because it gave me the opportunity to go back, review it, really plan it out. So something that was helpful for me is, as I was doing that work, I would remind myself about the components of a story, which are actually pretty simple. Every story has a beginning, middle, and end. And I think that especially when we approach talking about situations like having experienced foster care or other, really momentous experiences in our lives, that we often think that we need to tell the whole story from the beginning to the very end and not leave out any details in between. But in actuality, you get to decide where your story starts. You get to decide where the middle is, where the beginning is, and how it ends. And I think that that's a really powerful tool for folks to remember when sharing their foster care experiences. So you can actually start a blog or start your story from when you entered college. That could be the beginning. You don't necessarily need to go back to when you were 5 or 6 years old and what your life was like from then. And also, stories, as long as you have those 3 components, it can really be as short or as long as you'd like. So there's really, there's a very loose structure with stories, and that's just the beginning, middle, and end, and there's not too much more to it than that. But when we think about starting a blog, it can feel really overwhelming, right? Where do you start in that story, in that beginning, middle, and end? So what I found to be really helpful is to map out your reasons for writing in the first place. So what's driving your desire to want to participate in writing a blog or writing another written version of your story? And then setting a vision was really, really helpful for me, and I'll go into in just a minute on the next slide about how to go about doing that. But that really helps you kind of cater why you're writing and give you some inspiration in those times when you may not know what to write next. And looking for inspiration can be really helpful. Going back to your favorite book or stories or other blogs out there, and really looking at what other people have done that can help you decide what you want to do. But when you think about, where to start, because starting a blog, like I said, can feel so overwhelming, start with an introduction. Who are you? What is this blog about? It doesn't need to be super planned out. You can really just start from who are you? And that's just a great introduction to a blog. So to map out a little bit about how I went about choosing a vision and kind of a mission statement for the blog, which I didn't have to begin with. I really started writing the blog kind of free form, whatever I thought would make a good blog entry. But I quickly discovered that really would be beneficial for me if I had some sort of outline and if I understood, why I was really writing. So you can read the whole kind of vision statement on the blog there, but I highlighted a few key parts here. And I used person-first language when I said that it was one student's journey. I was really intentional about the words that I used to describe myself and what I would be writing about. Next, I decided that I wanted to offer suggestions for both students and professionals. So I told people in the vision, what they could expect from my blog. And finally, the intention part of the vision statement was extremely important to me because I realized early on that the blog was not the way that I wanted to maybe tell my story to friends or family members. The blog was really intended for a specific audience, which is where I outlined that it was for professionals and other folks who had experienced foster care. And that was really helpful for me and gave me a lot of peace in knowing that if somebody did stumble across my blog in the internet, on the internet, which did happen on several occasions, they would have a clear understanding of where I was coming from and who I was imagining that I was talking to with the blog. Finding inspiration for where to create a mission statement and where you want the blog to go, that can feel really, really tough in the beginning, especially if you're a new blogger and you may not write as much. So I really wanted to share some tips now about where to find inspiration for writing. So, I think reading something that you enjoy and noticing what you like, whether that's a magazine, a novel, an anime, comic book, whatever you enjoy reading in your free time, pay attention to why you like it and try to, incorporate those same things in your own writing. You can, of course, use prompts to help with inspiration, which I find to be, really helpful. So if there's, one issue that comes to mind and you want that to guide your individual blog entry or series of blogs, I think that can really help you kind of get over that writer's block that often happens. So I have included some prompts on the screen here, such as, what is a day in your life like? What's a foster care statistic that bothers you? But there's a more extensive list in the handout entitled Writing Prompts that you can view in the control panel on the right side of your screen, and that'll just open up in an internet window there for you. And there's some foster care specific prompts for folks who want to specifically talk about that experience, but there's also some general ones for when you may not want to focus on that experience. I also wanted to include a sample structure of what a typical blog may look like, or a typical story. And again, your blog can look exactly like you'd like it to, or however when you share your story, if it is in a written format or verbally, it can really, you can choose exactly what you want to do with it, but I sometimes find that, especially working with folks who are new to sharing their story, having some semblance of structure can be helpful. So first, I would just encourage folks to have an introduction, whether you're speaking or writing, give the audience an expectation about what they're about to hear. And having some sort of focus statement can be really helpful with that. So maybe answering the question, I am here today because, or I am writing this because. It's a really simple way to help narrow down the focus and where you're going to go with that. And that can also help when you're trying to think about establishing boundaries too. How much to share, how in detail do I go? Next, just explaining why you feel this way. So we all have beliefs, especially surrounding about our experiences from foster care, and using an experience that illustrates, why you feel that way can be a really great way to draw readers in. Or again, if in audiences, if you're speaking about your experience. And then just ending by, reminding readers what that main point, that focus statement was, and then maybe share what's coming up next. So if you're speaking, the next thing that they can expect to see, or what's next on your blog, or if you're just engaging in conversation with a friend, where you want the conversation to go next. And that way you feel like you're in control of your story. There's also tons of inspiration on the internet if you just Google how to write a blog, or an example of a professional speech, or even tips for having a difficult conversation with a friend. There's tons of resources out there, so reviewing some of the ones that pop out to you can also be helpful. So now I want to launch into some things to keep in mind when sharing your story. And this is where I'll go over how to create some boundaries, how to tackle intrusive questions, and some questions for students to ask when they're presented with opportunities to share their story. And I've gleaned these from talking to other folks who have shared their stories, and then also some things that I've learned and observed in my professional work that I've done. So first, it feels really a lot better to share your story when you're in control of it. So one way to do that is to always be truthful. It's a lot easier to share and feel like you're in control if you know that everything that you've said is authentic and truthful, and you don't need to remember presenting one thing a certain way. So being truthful is just one way that you can go in and immediately from the start take control of your story. And choosing your outlet wisely, reviewing the organizations or reporters or outlets that you've been asked to share your story in, you have control in whether or not you say yes or no. And so really choosing those based on where you think that you would feel comfortable. Deciding early on what you are willing and not willing to share, and reevaluating often, because this can really change based on where you are, where you're at in your own personal journey, as you grow, whether or not you're currently applying for a job. So reevaluating where those boundaries are, and I'll share some tips with you in this next section of how to do that. And next, going into it with being prepared for questions and also assumptions about what it's like to be in foster care or have experienced something that not everybody can relate to. So going into that interaction where you're sharing your story and expecting those questions and assumptions can just help you feel more prepared when they come. And finally, asking for support when you need it. And that was something that I also had to learn, because I think you always go into a situation hoping for the best, but sometimes you do have those more intrusive questions or things that don't feel so comfortable. And so knowing that you have some support or somebody to talk to if those things do happen, that can really help you feel like you're more in control. And then we're going back to your reason for sharing. And so this can really help you in those moments where you maybe regret doing one particular part of sharing your story, or you're not quite sure if you did okay or how other people received it. Remembering your reason for sharing in the first place and wanting to start a blog or give a speech, that can be really beneficial and validating in those moments. And so next, another way that you can help feel in control of your story is if you take control of the language that you'd like to use when talking about your experiences and describing yourself. And so something that I've always felt really passionate about is I don't necessarily like to be called, a foster kid or even, foster alumni. I would much prefer that people say that I have experience in foster care, and that's just one example of person-first language. And one of the ways that I came to realize this about myself, that I preferred different languages, and my story and talking about my experiences without using some words like foster care, court ward, child welfare, systems. And so I've included a handout on the control panel on the right side of your screen, and that's an exercise that students can participate in where you actually write a biography about yourself without using these words. And this can be really helpful in thinking about the other components of your story, because we are all so much more than our experiences and the things that have happened to us. And I think that especially when talking about foster care specifically, there's lots of just pre-existing images and stigma and words that come up in people's minds when you immediately throw out that you were from foster care. And so really being able to describe what you've been through and what you'd like to say without using some of these words can really help you realize that there are other ways to define yourself, and there are other aspects of your story that really go beyond just being involved in the child welfare system or a court case. So I found this to be really empowering, and I've actually done this exercise with students where they were involved in a campus-based support program that was specifically for young people who have been through foster care, and we talked about how to talk to other people about the program without using these words in case they didn't want to share that they were in foster care, just to talk about what it meant to be part of that program. And I think that it was beneficial for them because it really helped them realize that there are other ways to talk about different things in their life without disclosing their foster care experience if they didn't want to. And so then that comes to creating boundaries, because oftentimes we may want to share a portion about our life or our past or about our experiences without having to disclose that we were in foster care, or that we may not have contact with our biological parents, for example. And it can feel really difficult at first to know how much to disclose, when it doesn't feel good to disclose, and what's a safe place. So one way that I've found that can be really helpful in discerning, when it is a good time to share your story, is to actually practice saying it out loud, which might seem kind of silly at first, but if you actually stand in front of a mirror and prepare either a speech that you want to give or a conversation you want to have with a friend where you go back and talk about your family of origin, or also just reading a blog entry out loud, just seeing how it affects you and seeing, for example, you start crying as soon as you mention, one part of your history, or if you notice that it's really difficult to even have the words come out of your mouth when you're talking about another, that can be a really good indication of maybe that's a boundary you want to set where you're not quite ready to share that part of your past yet. And then early on, claiming that language that you prefer. So going through your story and deciding, yeah, it does feel okay to say I'm from foster care, or I would prefer to say, oh, I'm from a family that's not my biological family. Whatever language sounds best and is easiest for you, claiming that early on can be a really important boundary to set. And then actually going through and setting very specific limits about what part of your story you'd like to share can really help be a guide, especially if you're nervous, giving a speech or having a conversation that you may not expect. So I've also included another handout called Creating Boundaries, and it's a list that's blank, but it's just like the one I have up here on the screen. And that can also be a good exercise for students and other folks who are just looking to learn more about sharing their story to help you identify, where you want to go in a conversation and where you don't. So, and these are just examples, not necessarily things unique to my personal experience, but something that I may decide I feel comfortable sharing going into an interaction is that I was in foster care in the state of Michigan. However, I may not want to go into what kind of residential placement I was in, or what my individual placements looked like, and so I would put that on the things I don't feel as comfortable sharing side. And then also, I often stray away from conversations about what my current relationships with my family looks like, and so that's a boundary that I've learned to create over time too that I would have on this list. And so this way you can kind of actually visualize, here's the part of my story that I feel really comfortable going into in any situation that I'm in, and these are the things that I need to take more care with when I do want to talk about them. And if anyone else who's listening has other ideas that you'd like me to include about creating boundaries, please utilize the chat function on the right side of your screen. And there are some times that people should think twice about sharing their story. And I am in no way saying that if these things are true that you should not share your story, but these are just some indications that you may want to really give it some thought when you're asked to share your story or when you feel like it's the right time. So first of all, if you don't want to share your story, I would say don't. You own everything that happened to you, and if it doesn't feel safe, if it doesn't feel right, then you can certainly say no. Or again, going back to that concept of stories have a beginning, middle, and end. That's it. Sharing a version that only you feel comfortable with. And then, when talking about it will cause more emotional harm than good. So if you do that tactic where you practice saying your story in front of the mirror and you find that you become really distraught after talking about it, which is certainly okay and does happen, maybe weigh, well, the benefits of sharing my story, do those actually outweigh the emotional harm and distress that it might cause me? And then the next one there, it says, with the sole purpose of captivating your audience. I found that sometimes when conversations about the experience of foster care arise, especially when you have important people in the room or if you're on a panel, sometimes you have that captivating audience and you have people listening, it may feel easier to share parts of your story than you intended. And so if your sole purpose is just because you have an audience or just because you really want to engage people in conversation and you haven't actually decided whether or not you're ready to share parts of your story, I would say to think twice about that, because I think it does really bring some validity to certain conversations about child welfare. If you say, well, I know what I'm talking about. I was in the foster care system. And it can feel easy to blurt those things out too before you're actually ready to share them. And so if that's your sole purpose, where you're thinking, oh, I just want to kind of join the conversation and keep that attention on my story, maybe think twice about it. And again, this is tricky to navigate. And again, going back to that idea of healing yourself or other people, stories can be really healing and they can be really empowering and feel wonderful to share. But if your only intent with sharing your story is because you think it'll heal you or if it will heal someone else, I want you to kind of go back to those other things we talked about whether or not you're ready to share your story or whether you can get through it without feeling really distraught. Because it's not your job to share your story, and you never have to if you don't want to. So please just don't feel obligated to share it, especially if you think that you're just doing it because you want to make a difference in someone else. There are so many other ways to do that without having to disclose something that you're not ready to. And something that I've had to learn, that it was actually Janan from FSM, we had a conversation about this, and she told me that, I can't control what other people think. And so often when I would talk about my own personal experience, I would want a certain reaction, or there was a reaction that I was hoping for, or that I was trying to avoid. And we had a conversation that it's not my job, and I really can't control what other people think or how they react to my experience. So I realized that I can't control it, but I can give them something to think about. And so that's where I sort of decipher, what am I willing to give people to think about, and where do I draw those lines? And knowing that I feel good about sharing it without needing a reaction from someone else. And asking for feedback can be really helpful in those moments when you're trying to decipher, what is too much to share, how is this going to be received, because it can feel really, really scary to talk about your personal experience, especially if it involves something like foster care or another adverse experience. And I think editing is a really great way to do that, especially if you're sharing through writing, but especially when you're talking about something that's very personal and authentic and unique to your experience. Editing is tricky. You can't really edit for, facts. It's not the editor's job to say you shouldn't feel this way. And so oftentimes when I would send blogs to Fostering Success Michigan for the blog that I was writing, I would receive very few comments back, and that was because, it was my belief that they didn't want to influence my words because I was able to share freely, which was, wonderful. But sometimes when you're actually looking for feedback, and wondering, how are folks going to receive this, it can feel a little bit tricky. And so I've identified some questions that you can ask that aren't necessarily asking people to give feedback on your individual story or have a reaction, but are more specific and helping make your point. So for example, is the point that I'm trying to make, is it clear? And I think that that's, a way that somebody can give you some feedback, but without actually editing you down or trying to change what you were saying. And again, asking, is my blog or is my story easy to understand? You're not asking folks to edit the content, but you're just asking, is how I'm presenting this, is it coming through? Is there anything I can do to make it better? Then also, I think it's fair to ask anyone about for basic spelling and grammar. So if you are sharing your story and talking about a speech, asking somebody to say, is there another way that I could phrase this, or is there something else that you suggest? And again, these are questions that don't directly relate back to your personal experience, but it's just how it's in the presentation of your personal experience. And I think that content overall is the most important thing. So even if there is a spelling mistake or something's a little bit unclear, if you're true to yourself and if you're authentic and sharing your authentic story, I think that that's the most important thing. And there are some questions that you can ask when approach to share your story, and I've tried to design these so that they're applicable for all types of situations, whether that's sharing your story through writing or through the media or in a presentation. And so following a basic format of kind of like who, what, when, where, why, those typical questions that you may think of when approaching any situation, and really taking these into specifics and making them concrete questions that you can ask professionals or folks who approached you in the first place. And for professionals out there, I believe that these are the questions that you should be prepared to answer whenever you are asking somebody to share their personal experience. So the simple question of, what is the purpose of the event? So thinking if you were asked to share your story in a speech, for example, or a welcome for a foster care related fundraiser, what is the purpose of the whole event, that the young person is being asked to speak? How many people will be there is a big one, knowing what the audience is going to look like. What is the format of the article, interview, or event? So I think that it's really important that whoever goes into the situation that they're prepared for what they're going to see, because when you see something like this room here, where you have tons of people looking out at you, and you really expected to see something like this classroom here, it can be extremely jolting. So again, it's really important to prepare people what they should go in expecting when they're asked to share their story. Going back to the list here, how will my story be shared? So if you are, sharing a blog for Fostering Success Michigan, for example, asking, how will that blog be distributed? Is it through email? Is it through social media? And then also asking, will any media be attending the event, or are media on this, email listserv? how and where will the event be advertised is another one. We've seen experiences where sometimes events are advertised like on a college campus, for example, and a student speaker may be featured on the advertisement. And if the student didn't know that the advertisement was going to be put, in like the student center for, it can be really jolting if you're just going about your day and then seeing you affiliated with a foster care type event that you didn't, consent to or were prepared for. And then finally, asking if you're expected to participate in a question and answer session, and this is really more geared toward those physical events where you're actually, talking to folks in that setting. But oftentimes, panels may have, scripted questions ahead of time, but there may be a spot for question and answer. So that's just a good thing to prepare folks about. Again, to avoid moments like these when you're a little bit shocked about your surroundings. So tackling intrusive questions. No matter how you share your story, I think that there is some room for judgment, but I think that for the most part, all of the questions I've ever received and seen people ask about foster care are well-meaning. It's really to usually gather more information, but sometimes the delivery doesn't always feel the most comfortable. And so it can feel a little bit intrusive, and I think that there certainly are inappropriate questions out there, but for the most part, the types of questions that I've ever been asked, they do come from a very good place. So that's been helpful for me to remember. But I have gained some skills throughout sharing my experience in those different formats to tackle the ones that do feel like they're a little bit too personal. So some of them that I've highlighted here, why were you in foster care? That's a big one that usually people ask as soon as you share that you've had some experience in the system. Are you in therapy? People have asked me that before. What are your current relationships like? Do you still talk to your biological parents? What about your foster parents? How many foster care placements were you in? And the list goes on. I mean, there are tons of questions that you can ask that, given the format and the structure and the conversation, may feel inappropriate or intrusive. So there are a number of ways that you can respond to them, but some of the ways that I've found that you can respond in a way that still feels professional and kind, where you're not just saying, really? Like, really? I can't believe that you're asking that, because that may be your first reaction to how you may want to respond to the questions. There are different ways to go about it. So some of the phrases that I've used in the past are simple, saying, I don't share that information, or I'd prefer to keep that private. And I think that the delivery and the way that you say a lot of these things really does mean something, because there's such a difference from saying, oh, I actually prefer to keep that private. That's just not something I share. Saying it that way compared to, I keep that private. And there's a difference there. So if you are a student in a professional situation where you feel like you do want to respond in a professional way, thinking about how your tone and the way that you present these things can be helpful. But you are completely in the right to say, I'd prefer not to answer that, or I'd rather talk about that at a different time, or that feels too personal. And that's another way that you can help create boundaries in those conversations. And I do want to highlight the bottom two phrases here and their lead-ins. They say, something I would love to share with you is, and that's a way that you can continue on the conversation, especially if you don't want to just, put a stop to the conversation about foster care, but that you can redirect it. Or you can also answer the question by saying, for some people who have experienced foster care or who have had that experience, this may be helpful, without actually sharing how it applies to you or sharing your personal information. So what you need to know with working with the media, because these are some times that there are some specific questions that may initially feel intrusive, and but you do want to participate in sharing your story, especially with a media outlet. There are some things that you can keep in mind. And this list was originally developed with help from Sarah Alvarez and as an InfoWire piece. So always assume that you're on the record whenever you're talking with a reporter, and your experience is part of a much larger story. So I think that when reporters are gathering their information for a story, we usually gather a lot of info because we're trying to provide the most educated and detailed perspective that we can for a story. And so your personal experience may not make it into the full radio piece. You could talk with a reporter, for example, for 2 hours at length, and only one quote ends up in the final radio piece or article. And so just remembering that there is a larger goal to the story that you're involved with. And then it's really, it's not the media's job to paint a picture of yourself that you're proud of. It's really their job to report the truth. So keep that in mind too, that oftentimes, when you're interviewed, it's their goal is not to paint you as this, maybe perfect picture, but it's to uncover the truth for a story that they're working on. It's not always easy to retract what you've already shared, so do keep that in mind. If you do, start talking about your story and maybe you didn't make the list that we talked about earlier in the webinar and you end up, sharing something that you realize didn't feel so great, it's not always easy to retract that. So going into interviews or conversations with reporters with kind of clear expectations and boundaries can be helpful. And you are also always able to talk on background. So that's just providing education about a particular topic to a reporter. So if you don't want your personal experience shared, but you do want to talk about some aspects of your experience or what that was like for you, you can ask to talk on background. And those conversations usually aren't recorded. And you can always choose just to use your first name instead of your full name, which especially if you're a younger person or a student and you're not quite sure if your future profession is going to relate to your foster care experience, maybe choosing just your first name is one way to avoid professionals reaching out to you, on LinkedIn, and also linking your experience in foster care to your professional endeavors. But again, that's completely your decision. And then keeping in mind, too, that it's always okay to decline questions from the media. You don't need to answer something. And I think, self-care is a really big and important part of sharing your story in any setting, but especially with the media. So if you do share your story with a news outlet, or if it's published online or something along those lines, planning to talk with somebody before and after can be really helpful and can really help you feel like you're supported. Clearing your schedule if possible after something is made. Choosing social media wisely. So if you are featured in an article or, a speech that you gave is going to be broadcasted online, really thinking about who's on your social media networks before you share it, that can, help you take control of your story. And then being proud of yourself and what you've experienced and what you've shared, because it's not easy to go back through your past and to present it in a way that is relatable to other people. So really being able to pat yourself on the back and saying, I really did go through a lot and I'm able to share it in a really positive way, and it takes a lot of bravery to do that. And being proud of yourself is a really important part of that. And something else to mention about self-care is that it can feel really easy to write a blog about your experience or to map out what you're going to say in a speech about having been in foster care when you're in the confines of your own room, or if you're in a really safe space, and you may not always visualize the space that you'll actually be in when you're presenting these things, or what it's going to feel like when a blog that you wrote at 10 o'clock at night in your bedroom with your cat on your lap, which is often how I've done my writing, you may not know what that feels like when it's actually shared on Facebook at 10 o'clock the next morning and everybody's responding to it. And so really thinking ahead of time what that's going to be like. And that's why self-care can really come in and be an important part of sharing your story. And also I think something to mention too about self-care is to share your story carefully in a way that you've already gone through the things personally that you're planning on sharing. So if it's a part of your story that you maybe haven't thought of in many years and really haven't sat with or uncovered, sharing it in a very public way on a stage or in a blog that's published on the internet may not be the very best way to approach that the first time. And again, that for some people can be really healing, and maybe for them that is the perfect way to go back and dig through it, but it's not for everyone. And so really sitting with your experiences and choosing carefully what you would like to share can really help you feel more in control. I've really enjoyed spending some time with you and talking about sharing your stories, and I would love to answer some questions if any of you have them, or if you'd all like to share tidbits that you've gleaned by listening to student stories or sharing your own story. I think that now would be a great time for that. I'm going through the chat comments now to see if anybody's written in with different questions or comments, and feel free to do that if you have any. I'm noticing that we have a lot of professionals in the audience, and so I would love to hear, how sharing student stories is important for the work that you're all doing, if you all can take a moment to type that in. Okay, we have a question here about how do you protect others that are a part of your story without compromising your own story? And thank you so much for asking this because I think that this is a really important thing to think about. And I'll go back to a quote that I read. I don't remember where I first found it, so I apologize for being unable to credit the person who said it. But the quote said that, you own everything that happened to you, and if people wanted you to write warmly about them, they should have behaved better. And that's one way of thinking that's helped me in those moments where I realized that if I'm sharing my authentic experience and if I'm being truthful about something that happened, I do own that part of my life and my experience, but I would say to go back to that mission statement of why you're sharing your story in the first place and why you're sharing a blog, and seeing if sharing things about people that might be compromising to them is in line with your mission. So whenever I was writing a blog or sharing my personal experience, my intent was never to hurt or bring negative attention to people involved in my story. And so if I was going through my story and I realized, oh, this comment may not look so great for the person who is in my story, or it's not painting them in the best light, I would go back to my mission of, why am I sharing this? Is it to bring awareness to this issue? Is it to share, a truthful account of my story from beginning to end? Is this relevant to my story? I would sift through with those comments, and I would really sit with it for a little while and decide if it's in line with what I'd like to do. But I do think that you own everything that happened to you, and unfortunately, especially with the experience of foster care, there are some hardships in there, and there have been some mistakes that people have made, and sometimes talking about your experience involves talking about those actions of other people. And I would say take it by a case-by-case basis. And one way to go about doing that too is to ask permission. So if you are per se writing a novel, or going at length into your story, and there is something that you feel important about sharing, and you feel like you need somebody's permission, ask them, have a conversation, and say, here's my story, and here is the part of it that you're involved with, and I wanted to let you know that this is being published, or that I will be sharing it, and just giving them kind of a heads up. That's one way to approach those situations, but unfortunately, I don't think there's necessarily an easy answer to that question, but it's a really good one. Another question that's come in is, do you have experience in sharing this information in a training for other staff that collaborate with programs that work with former foster youth? So I have done trainings mostly with young people about sharing their story. I'm trying to think. I don't know that I've actually done any training specifically for staff in helping young people share their stories, but I would certainly be open to that if you'd like to reach out to me with my email address there. And this webinar will be available on Fostering Success Michigan's website, and I encourage you to review it with staff and other students and youth. There's a quote here and a comment that I'll share. It says, sharing stories helps to add context to the policy and research data, creates a space for connection to real people, and redefines what we believe about students who have experienced foster care. And thank you, Becky, for sharing that. And I think that that's a really powerful way that illustrates how student stories can be really integral to the work that so many professionals out there are doing. We have another question here that says, how can professionals protect students from feeling like charity cases when asked to speak at fundraising or donor events? Thank you, Andrea, for asking this question. I think that this is a really good one. I would say that, going through some of the points in the webinar where I talked about how students can take control of their story by claiming their language, I would give them a space to do that. So, asking students to share their experience in foster care, share their story, start out that conversation by saying, how do you refer to your past? Or I'm really interested in hearing more about this time in your life, but I want to make sure that we talk about it in a way that you're proud of and that you're okay with. So help me navigate this. Can we plan this event together? Or can we plan this portion of the event together where you're going to speak? I would be very upfront with the goal of the event. So if it is a fundraiser, for example, and you're asking a student to do an introduction or to talk about how a certain donation or scholarship has played an important role in their life, I would be extremely upfront about that and just say, the goal of the event is to raise money, and we're hoping that your story can help expose some of the barriers that young people from care face, and that's why we're asking you to share it. Are you okay with that? And hopefully if students have been able to make a mission for why they want to share their story, or if they can really think about kind of that focus statement like I talked about in the webinar, and they can decide whether or not those things are in line with the event. And so those are some ways that you can help young people feel like they have control sharing their story in those types of situations. But really, I think that the question that you're asking often does relate back to how people respond to students sharing their story. So if people respond with a lot of pity, or if people kind of do like the whole, poor me, poor you kind of thing, it may very well turn out to look like or feel like a charity case situation. But that's when I would encourage moderators of the event or young people themselves to kind of help establish those boundaries. And moderators can also play a really important role in helping tackle intrusive questions. I don't think that the responsibility should always be to the student. And with all of my experience working with FSM, they've always done a great job at redirecting questions when they come in a public way. But sometimes, especially if a student is speaking at a busy event, some of those conversations happen on the side after the event has already ended, when you may not actually be able to intervene. I have another question here that says, I've experienced a certain level of fatigue when it comes to responding to some of the intrusive questions. Do you have any advice? I feel you. I definitely feel you on that. And yes, it can feel extremely exhausting to be asking questions that feel inappropriate or intrusive, especially when you're asked for them time and time again. So you may need to say a couple times to a couple different people, hey, this does feel a little bit personal, or this is something that I just don't talk about, but it's something that I've come to expect. So I know that if I'm going into an event sharing my story, or if I'm asking somebody else to share their story at an event, there may be that space for intrusive questions. So part of that would be, self-care before and after, because that fatigue that you mentioned is extremely real. So making space for that, trying to avoid doing things, before or after the event. And again, that's similar for sharing your story if it's just in a conversation or writing, knowing that it might be just a difficult time. So giving yourself that space afterwards. And then maybe practicing your responses too, because I think part of why it feels so tiring is sort of the shock of like, really, again, kind of that SNL moment that I shared, that clip where it's just like, oh, I would have thought that people would have learned by now. But again, if you're seeing somebody new or sharing your story in a different space, they may not know what your boundaries are. And so having those responses almost on autopilot, where you don't need to go through that whole reaction where you're expecting them and you kind of have that phrase in your back pocket, that can maybe help it feel not as tiring. But I feel you, and I'm sorry that you've had that experience. But maybe also, sharing your boundaries in the beginning, or saying, I welcome questions about my experience in college, not necessarily about my experience in foster care, and setting the boundaries for questions too might help. Let's see here. I wanted to share this quote quickly. It says, I don't have a question, but you asked how sharing the stories of the youth I work with affects my work. My youth stories are powerful, and I tell them this every time that we talk about speaking engagements. Their stories make the statistics a reality. And I think that's so true. And another thing that stories can do is really bring to light the work that organizations are doing. So that's another time that people may be asked to share their story, because they're actually trying to show how an organization has made an impact on them. So stories can also really help service providers feel good about the work that they're doing and really give some meaning to those organizations. So thank you for your comment, Crystal. That helps add to the conversation. We have another comment here that says, I work with recruiting foster parents, and at times I open the opportunity for former children that were in care to come to share their story to help others understand the need for foster parents and what children really need that are in care. And I think that that's wonderful. I think that it's also really important to share your story and about what your needs are and how those can help educate other folks who may be looking into foster care issues, or may be looking into how they can help support those students. And then we have another question here that says, can you share any experience you have in sharing your story with policymakers or other legislators? Yeah, I was able to participate in the Fostering Success Michigan Leadership Summit a couple of years ago, and that was a really great opportunity for students to share their stories and experiences with lawmakers. And one thing that I liked about that that interaction was that it was kind of a roundtable format. So there are a lot of students selected to share their experiences, and they all knew ahead of time that they would be given the opportunity to share that day. So there's a lot of preparation that went in, and it also wasn't, just one student carrying the weight. So that would be another tactic that, especially if you're dealing with policymakers, legislators, really important folks in the room, where there may feel like there's a lot of pressure, or you're kind of like in this surrounding that may not feel as comfortable because students probably don't regularly hang out in the state capitol. I think that having kind of an outline and an agenda for students of how the event's going to go and where one student isn't responsible for everything if possible would be a great time. Another experience that I've seen people share their experiences with legislators would be the Kids Speak events that I talked about earlier, sponsored by Michigan's Children, where there's a big audience and folks can come up, and again, they've had the chance to prepare their testimony and share it. And I think that that's also a time that can feel really powerful and impactful. But there's so many other ways that you can share your experience with legislators and lawmakers, finding out who your representative is, writing their office, and even writing a blog like for FSM that may very well reach those people. So if you haven't shared your experience yet in that way, there's certainly plenty of opportunities to do that. Let's see here. Hi, we have another question that says, and this is regarding the personal questions, kind of the intrusive ones. And somebody suggested that you can also sidestep them by answering in a general way. Are you in contact with your biological parents, for example, and responding with, a lot of young people who have experienced foster care do have some relationships with their biological families and could use support with setting boundaries in those relationships. And I completely agree with you, Melissa. She says it's a good way of getting a message across without answering really personal questions. Yes, I completely agree, bringing the conversation back to a more general sense. And if you'd like to share your story and infuse it with a more general perspective, I think that that's also a great way to avoid those kind of boundary stepping questions. We have another question that came in here. It says, how do you handle it when after sharing your story, you run into people who may have heard it and then approach you in your personal time? This is a great question. So I'm imagining the situation kind of like in an event space where you may share your story with an audience in a very, with a formatted time, like a predetermined setting. And then after that event space, when there's networking time or you see somebody in the hallway, you may be approached with some difficult questions that a moderator may not be in earshot for. And so if you're a student and you're going into that situation, I would sort of have that list in the back of my mind with like things I feel okay sharing, things I don't feel okay sharing, and then having a goal for that interaction. So if somebody comes up to you and you want it to be brief, saying something along the lines of, oh, I only have a couple minutes to chat, it's so nice to meet you, and then responding to any questions that they may have in a way that you feel comfortable with. But in terms of actually avoiding that, that would be completely up to the student or individual. I mean, you are more than welcome to say that you're not accepting any questions at the moment, or try to take more control of the conversation and taking it in a different direction. We have just a couple minutes left, so if there are any last questions, if you could type them now. And I've really enjoyed answering the questions, and I hope that my answers have been helpful. And please feel free to reach out to me via email. With my email is listed on the screen here if you'd like to follow up further or have questions that you think of after the webinar.
Brittany, this is Maddie, just joining you. And one thing that, as you have presented such excellent information, it really occurs to me that the power of the connections that our students have with the supportive adults and professionals in their life, and vice versa, are just so important. And so as, some of those challenging circumstances may arise where students are, being asked questions that may be inappropriate or maybe at an inappropriate time, that even if the professional or supportive adult isn't available in that moment to navigate that question with the student, that they are available or can make themselves available to debrief afterward, and that afterward may not be directly afterward. It may be in a couple days, a couple weeks, even further down the road, as sort of the full impact of that, that boundary crossing in a way may land with the student. And so just, for me, that's one of the things that hearing you answer some of these questions that just reminds me how important it is that we as professionals just make ourselves available to the students that we're working with, every day so that they can process some of that. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about that as we close out here.
Yeah, I think that that's a really great point. And I think too, something that I mentioned earlier was that a lot of these questions that can feel intrusive or inappropriate or being asked at an inappropriate time, they really are usually asked with a specific goal in mind, and that's usually not to step over those boundaries with a student, but it's usually to get more information about the experience of foster care, or to increase understanding or clear up a misunderstanding that they have about foster care. So if you are a student or a professional in those moments and feeling really frustrated with why a specific question was asked, going back to the intention behind it, because I would say that 9 times out of 10, it's not that person's goal to step over those boundaries with the student or put them in a situation that they're not comfortable with.
Absolutely. Well, I just want to say thank you so much, Brittany, for your amazing webinar. You're always just such a pleasure to learn from and learn with. And, it's been a wonderful opportunity to have you blogging with us, but also just to have you share your insights through this webinar. I know that you have said that you have made yourself available, and I loved that. Really do email me. So for those of you listening out there, if you have follow-up questions for Brittany, just thoughts that you want to share, please do contact her directly. One exciting announcement that we have is that starting in January 2016, we will be inviting several new bloggers representing different campus-based support programs across the state of Michigan to be blogging with us as our FSM student bloggers. So we're super excited to add new voices, new student experiences to our blog, really continuing with giving that student voice to the work that we do, to the experience directly for our students as they're making their way to and through the education to career pipeline. For those of you that maybe joined us a little bit late, just want to remind you that this recording and all of the handouts will be available on the FosteringSuccessMichigan.com website on Thursday. I do believe that there is a website resource available now that has the handouts, so if you wanted to get a preview of those early, you can look at the handouts now. You can Google the title of this blog, you can Google Brittany and either one of those things, you can search via the search function on our website, and either way those will come up, but the recording will be available on Thursday. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we hope that you have a wonderful day.